Latitude Media, covering the new frontiers of the energy transition.
3 years ago, I was shocked when the Inflation Reduction Act got signed into law. We all know the top-line story. It went something like this.
The Democrats' reform bill is the largest investment in climate policy in U.S. history, including over $300 billion to address global warming.
After Democrats passed the IRA, it became the financial driver of an expanding climate tech ecosystem. Within 2 years, it had supported a whopping $115 billion of investment in projects and factories all across the U.S. and across climate tech industries. And it was expected to unlock nearly $3 trillion in private investment by 2032. And then came Donald Trump.
That is why today I will also declare a national energy emergency. We will drill, baby, drill.
And over the last 8 months, his administration has worked to dismantle much of that progress, including withholding funds, canceling loans and grants, and working with Congress to roll back tax credits. Frankly, it's a pretty gloomy moment for all of us working in climate. But that's not the full story, or at least the story isn't finished yet.
There are plenty of Republicans that understand that this is one of those unique opportunities when you can get the alignment of self-interest. And that's how you get a collaboration. That's how you get a compromise.
I'm Lara Pierpoint, and this is The Green Blueprint, a show about the architects of the clean energy economy. This week, I sit down with U.S. Senator John Hickenlooper of Colorado, one of the lawmakers behind the IRA, to talk about passing the landmark climate law and protecting it now. He also offers ideas for building a bipartisan coalition for permitting reform. Despite the White House's opposition to climate and clean tech, Senator Hickenlooper is surprisingly optimistic about future policy wins. His message? Climate advocates should lean into bipartisan opportunities. During negotiations over the One Big Beautiful Bill, some Republican lawmakers pushed to preserve IRA tax credits because 85% of the investments and 2/3 of the jobs were going to red states. That's why the final bill wasn't as bad for clean tech as it could have been, and why there may still be a path forward on climate policy, especially permitting reform. So, here's our conversation. So I want to start by talking with you about the Inflation Reduction Act, which passed in 2022. I will never forget the moment I found out that it had passed because I basically fell out of my chair. I think me and everyone like me, we were all absolutely shocked beyond belief that it was something that truly went forward. So you were instrumental to that moment, very much deeply negotiating tenets of the IRA. So can you take us back to that time where you were working with your colleagues? What drove you to be so intimately involved in the end, and what was your role in ultimately getting the IRA passed?
Well, I was very lucky that Joe Manchin took me under his wing. Because he recognized that I was a former governor like him, and that sometimes it takes former governors a while to get into the meetings where you're actually having an effect. So he used to have these meetings, bipartisan meetings out on his boat. That's where a lot of the bipartisan infrastructure bill took place and got negotiated. That's where a lot of the Inflation Reduction Act kind of got its start. And Joe Manchin really is a fiscally conservative person, and he's progressive. He believes in all of the above. He thinks you need natural gas and oil, but you need wind, you need solar. And so the Inflation Reduction Act owed a lot to the fact that he stayed with it. Now, a couple of times he said he was done. He said, no, that's too far. I'm not going to go. That's too far. And that's where, and it wasn't just me. It was me. I think Chris Coons also played a role in talking to him. But I had that benefit of having been a former governor and having been pretty close to him through the Inflation Reduction or the bipartisan infrastructure bill. So I would find an excuse to talk to him every single day and just to check on him and how was he doing and if he was really over and going to quit. And he told the press he was out, he was done. I saw him the next morning, had a nice 15-minute happy chat. And I said, well, you're not really over, you're not quitting, are you? And he goes, no, but I'm going to let him think it for a while. I need space. Something along those lines. He says, I'm not going to talk to the press for a while, is what he said. But he said he wasn't quitting. So that day we had a meeting with a bunch of, I think we had 4 or 5 CEOs of large nonprofit organizations that are very active in environmental issues and especially around climate. And they were really kind of doom and gloom. And I was a little mischeerful, saying, hey, this isn't over. And we've all got to stay positive. If we don't stay positive, what are the chances we're going to win? And I think mostly when I said that, I believed it. And sometimes sometimes I had to, pretend a little bit, And so when I was with Joe Manchin and talking to other senators, I tried to pretend to be more ebullient and more optimistic than perhaps I really was. And I think I got to be more ebullient. I mean, I think that's sort of who I became from that role. And, it's funny, everyone says it was a reconciliation project, the Inflation Reduction Act. We didn't get a single Republican vote because every one of the Republicans had taken an oath that they would never support any kind of tax increase. And we had a bunch of tax increases just on the truly well-off. I mean, the wealthiest of Americans, people making well over $400,000, in most cases, people that were making more than $1 million a year. But there were some tax increases, so we knew we weren't going to get a single Republican vote. But because, Chris Coons and myself and Joe Manchin, a bunch of us were talking to Republicans and incorporating their priorities in this bill, it really is a bipartisan bill. They may hate to admit it, and they say that it was a reconciliation ram down, is what they sometimes say. But that's really not true. I mean, there's so much. Trust me, if the progressive part of the Democratic Party had gotten their way, this bill would have been 5 times bigger than it ended up being. The one great thing that they always forget is we put all these resources. Once you got the bill close to being passed and we started really focusing on it, we put so many resources in there that really we're going to not just benefit the economy, but really clean up our air for our health, really make the biggest, significant, most large-scale investment to deal with climate change in the history of the world. All that stuff was happening at the same time that we were actually lowering the deficit. In other words, the Inflation Reduction Act really was diminishing the size of the deficit, restraining the growth of government spending. Part of it was we put a whole bunch more money into the Internal Revenue Service because under the first term of President Trump, they in many ways eviscerated the IRS ability to investigate the guys who are really cheating on their taxes. And that turns out to be hundreds of billions of dollars a year.
I mean, it was such an incredible bill with so many good things in it. I want to go back to something you said, though, because you mentioned that you sort of knew going into this process, or I guess you did know that you weren't going to get Republican votes on this bill. So why were you working with the Republicans in that case? Was it really about knowing that their involvement would make better policy, or was it something that Manchin was requiring, or what was your motivation for bringing them in?
Well, I've always believed that you get more durable policy, stronger policy if it's bipartisan. And we should recognize that, there's still 40% of the American people that stand firmly behind Donald Trump. And that doesn't make them less American than we are. We may disagree on a number of issues, and we may disagree on the fundamentals of the Constitution, for goodness sakes. But they're still part of our tribe. They're still Americans. Joe Manchin had a big part to do with the fact that we would always reach out to Republicans, because in that same sense that I have, he felt that Republicans would only add value and that we had to kind of balance that out. And it was great because he's a pretty conservative, a very fiscally conservative person himself. And by being the go-between, he allowed them to take a lot of the hits for his own budgetary caution, let's call it. In other words, but still, we spent hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars addressing climate change in that bill, something that had never been done before. And we can criticize it, but still, it's an amazing accomplishment.
So then ultimately it was successful. But let's switch gears and talk about what's happening now, because unfortunately it hasn't really stayed that way. And so the new administration came in. One of the first things that started happening is, things just slowed down. Everything slowed down to a halt with this administration in terms of actually deploying against the IRA, actually providing the tax guidance for some of the incentives that were in the bill. So can you start by saying a little bit about what you've seen over the last year or so that has started to kind of erode some of the things that you all put together within the IRA?
Yeah, and that's that is the great sadness of this, is that we, while we're doing all this work, other self-interests, and by this I mean, in this case, I'm talking about the oil and gas industry, and it's not just the big companies. If anything, it's more the mid-sized companies are spending enormous amounts of money to persuade Americans that climate change is overrated. And it's not that big a deal. We shouldn't have a sense of urgency. And I've studied these arguments, pro and con. Chris Wright, the new Secretary of Energy, is a true build, baby, build, devotee of the oil and gas industry, and doesn't believe that wind and solar is an effective use of government money to incentivize them. And when President Trump got elected, and we were aware that this might happen, I don't think any of us imagined that he would be this relentless in attacking and trying to claw back money that had been appropriated, legally appropriated, for purposes. There's court cases going on right now that will have a lot to say of whether he can legally do that. But now he's starting to do rescissions, which is a way you can cut back on appropriations, but by doing it through Congress, it's legal. So one of the things that was in the Inflation Reduction Bill, and really this has a lot to do with where we get solar, where we get wind, it's in rural areas and in many of the red states. So that's the smartest place to make these investments. So 85% of the Inflation Reduction Act environmental, renewable energy investments were going into red states. 2/3 of the jobs are in red states. So when the Republican House clearly was going to claw back everything, and we had to fight tooth and nail to get some victories when it came over to the Senate, but that battle meant that they had to answer to a lot of their House members are going to get killed when they go home, and they hear about how many jobs, how much investment in their community, because these investments established the United States as a leader in manufacturing wind and solar technology and infrastructure. We'll be a world leader. And so that means we will be selling panels and pumps and collectors and wind turbines, not just in the United States, but all throughout this hemisphere, all throughout Europe and Asia. We were poised to become world leaders. And now we're going to be giving that away to China. And I think those red states, the fact that 2/3 of the jobs and whatever it is, 85% of the total investment, it's all going to be in red states. But we'll see. Anyway, that's been very, very frustrating. When they came up and said, all right, we're going to use what they call I call it the big bad bill, but they were going to rip apart as much as they possibly could. I think the whole world, to a certain extent, felt like they're getting a punch in the gut.
I think that's exactly how we all felt. And I know you're not necessarily the standard bearer here, but what's your explanation for all of this? Why can't Republicans take yes for an answer? I mean, when you look at the fact that, as you say, all this investment is going into red states, when you look at the fact that this is a bill that 60% of the American population didn't like, what is happening that these Congress people are effectively, it seems that they're defying their constituents and doing things that are actively not in their constituents' interests? What's going on here?
Well, Trump's a big part of it, and he campaigned on this. And, when you look at where his soft money came from, and soft money, as I've said before, is so pernicious, so evil and corrosive to a democratic system like what we have. And a large part of his the dark money behind his campaign and his efforts to win the Senate and the Congress came out of oil and gas. And especially these mid-sized companies, every year that they get another year of the status quo, I mean, that industry is making $250 billion a year in profit. And for the life of me, I can't understand why we can't get a price on carbon. And I know some of my friends on the left disagree with me on this, but once you get a price on carbon, then the oil and gas industry isn't going to come unglued. They're going to go. They're going to accept it. They might not like it a little bit, but it's not going to make that big a difference because it's going to affect all of their businesses equally. And it's going to put them a little bit at a disadvantage for wind and solar because they're not generating any carbon. And that obviously would make such a concept, unthinkable for President Trump because he is so devoted to this notion of promoting coal, promoting carbon pollution in every way he can. And the only way I can explain it is that he wants to attack what is right and what most people believe in every way he can. Just like he attacks the media, calls them fake news, he lies in his speeches and then repeats the lies until people aren't sure what the truth is. He attacks, our war heroes. John McCain he attacked. All these things are ways he believes, I think, that he can consolidate more power. And it's unfortunate that we're going to be victims, that our climate and our environment are going to be victims to that kind of really thoughtless effort.
Right. I mean, it's just so crazy. Okay, well, so let's talk then about some of the specifics around this bill you mentioned, which, we all variously call one big beautiful bill or one big bear of a bill. I think there's some less children-friendly ways of referring to this as well. We might want to call it the reconciliation bill for purposes of this conversation. But what are some of the things in the reconciliation bill that most concern you, particularly with respect to climate and with what you fought so hard to gain with the IRA?
Well, that for me, what's most problematic, in fact, is that we made all these sacrifices, right? All these jobs, mostly in red states, all these amazing investments. The level of innovation we were already seeing and now is going to grind to a halt was going to create momentum that would last decades. And what did we do this for? We did this largely so we could give tax breaks to the truly wealthy. And Colorado's, I wouldn't say we're one of the richest states, but we have our fair share of billionaires. And I try to listen to their opinion on things. I spend probably more of my time doing, healthcare roundtables in rural areas and, trying to find workers roundtables where we can figure out how they're going to get retirement resources. But every billionaire I talk to, and this is like probably 5 people, and I ask them, do you care? And I remember one billionaire that he looked at me and he smiled and he says, just so you have a frame of reference, I would get $1.5 million tax break off of this bill. He says, last year, my income was $920 million. If you think I care about a $1.5 million tax break, you're mistaken, because it's not something I'm fighting for. And, if anything, he looked at me, he says, don't ever repeat my name, but I'm happy to pay another 3 or 4 or 5%. So I think there is a small number of people that care deeply about this, and they have control of the Republican Party and MAGA, and they're not going to back off. So, we did improve some things in the bill that could have been a lot worse. They were going to put a tax. The House bill came over and it had a tax on all wind energy and solar energy. So no longer are we going to give them tax credits, but we're going to tax them. The very things that we want to encourage, they're going to tax. And there's some other ways we softened the blow, right? We gave a softer landing, even for the wind and solar. They get till 2028, I think, or end of 2027, to at least make sure they fully initiated. Some of these other, geothermal and nuclear, some of these other innovative energy sources, if you believe in all of the above, which I do, they're going to have a longer runway. Some of them go out all the way to 2035. So some of those tax breaks are still going to be there. What's crazy is they're basically stamping out so much of the funding for the wind and solar that's in the queue to get built, right? That would go into operation in the next 1.5 or 2 years. And this is when we need, with AI, we're going to see all this new demand for energy. And this is right when, it takes, it's 4 to 6 years to get a turbine from GE or whoever manufactures the turbines. But 4 to 6 years to get one, that's a long time to wait when you're trying to ramp up capacity in the short term.
Yeah, no kidding. It's a very crazy thing. And I was thinking about that today as I saw the cancellation, or I should say the administration's attempted cancellation of a loan from the Loan Programs Office, a loan guarantee specifically for an energy transmission line, an electricity transmission line from Kansas to the Midwest. And it's like, these are exactly the kind of projects we need to power our data future. Like, this is, just full stop. It's really crazy what's happening. Okay, but there was more that you did too to help kind of protect some of the things in the bill. So you had an amendment that effectively protected a residential energy tax credit. Is that right?
Yeah. So we introduced an amendment to take that part of the Inflation Reduction Acts that applied to residential clean energy credit, and it would cover 30% of the cost of it was purchasing and installing. I'm pretty sure residential solar, the battery backup. It will allow you to utilize geothermal heat pumps, which actually, it turns out in Colorado and a lot of America, those heat pumps are very useful and cost effective and very, very clean. Our amendment would have, protected the program from Republican cuts for a year, which would have given clean energy, and a lot of these are small businesses, both in Colorado and around the country. It would have given them a runway to kind of weather the storm that the Republicans were creating. And they could have begun to prepare for the loss of that tax credit support. And again, that's the net, what we were trying to say was 85,000 jobs. So, and we had bipartisan support. Susan Collins ended up voting for our amendment, but ultimately it failed. But in the fight for that amendment and many of the other ones we put forward, again, we did soften the final bill in a number of, and it could have been much more, as bad as it is, it could have been much more horrible.
As hard as things are at the moment, John thinks there's hope. The interest in climate tech is truly bipartisan, and this makes John optimistic about future policy wins. We'll get to that after the break. Tell us about what happens from here. I mean, I think, we heard some interesting things like Senator Murkowski, for example, wound up voting for the bill, but said she thought it wasn't finished. And so I know that she and even Josh Hawley and others are trying to introduce new legislation now to kind of effectively walk back some of what's in that bill. So are you seeing a flurry of activity in that direction? Are you feeling hopeful that there's more that can be done with new legislation?
Well, we're certainly hopeful that we can. The question they're going to be faced with is they're going to be asked about pay-fors and how do you pay for something like this. But I think there's a number of ways to do that. And I think when you have as many people talking about it, it's like where you see smoke, usually there's fire somewhere. So I am optimistic. And part of it is letting them introduce the bills and giving them credit, which I am happy to do. I don't care who gets the credit. But if we could reinstitute even a third of those credits and incentives, it would be a big, big step, and I think appreciated by everybody. We're kind of worried about the Department of the Interior now is creating new rules that requires, 3 different levels of political appointees to review each, every action that the DOI, the Department of the Interior, takes, which is going to it's going to slow down and impact every single large wind and solar project. And they're just trying to gum things up. So again, that's the place where maybe someone like Josh Hawley can actually step in and have a sway. We've written letters. We've done what we can. I think, one thing also it's going to raise electricity bills. And this hasn't gotten out as much, but there are a couple studies out there that show between $100 and $400 a year just from existing, if no more demand comes on, if it doesn't get any worse, just with the status quo, the price could go up $400. For a lot of people trying to make rent at the end of the month, that's a lot of money. So as that comes out, again, hopefully there'll be enough different things like that come out so that we can really push back and get a few Republicans to come on and make a big difference.
Right. So another thing that we've been talking about for many years now is permit reform. And I know that this was something that there were a lot of folks who were really hoping that the IRA would start addressing this and making it easier to build particularly climate-forward infrastructure projects. We didn't manage to include it in the IRA. This is something that historically, at least you would think, would have bipartisan support, right? Because we're talking about reforming regulations that make it so hard to build things. But I'm seeing sort of a very crazy set of opinions. Again, I mentioned this electricity line today that was just canceled, and it's a whole bunch of Republicans, including Republican governors, that are coming out and saying we can't build this electricity line. And so I'm kind of like, what's going on here? Is there any hope for permitting reform? Is this something that you and your colleagues are discussing, or is it something that's just totally off the table because of the craziness of the moment?
Well, it's gotten into the partisan crosshairs, and it becomes a political football to kick back and forth. There are plenty of Republicans that understand that this is one of those unique opportunities when you can get the alignment of self-interest. And that's, in business, that's where good things happen. Is when you start out negotiating with someone and you think that you disagree on almost everything. And that as you talk, you begin to recognize, they're not really holding on to the part I care about. They'll give in on that. And what they really want is something I don't care that much about. Actually, we can get our self-interest to align pretty well. And that's how you get a collaboration. That's how you get a compromise. And I think that's where, right now, if you're in the environmental community, most people I know care deeply about climate change and have a great sense of urgency. We got to go now. Well, that means we've got to if you're going to have to build big, high voltage transmission lines to get green energy to where it's needed, we can't spend 15 years getting a permit before we even start building. Same thing with critical minerals. The world right now, we haven't changed our mining laws in the United States in over 100 years. So we're just a bunch of Band-Aids holding something together, and in most cases, no one would start a mine in the United States because it takes 10 or 15 or 20 years. We need more copper, more nickel. We know that. If we're going to have electric vehicles, if we're going to have an electrification of our economy, we need more of those precious minerals. Recycling is going to take a chunk of it, and I do not underestimate the importance of recycling. But every measure I've seen says we're going to have not just some mines in the United States, but around the world. If we did a mining bill and got the environmental community to sit down with let's call it the industrial community, the oil and gas industry, or the status quo industry, if they had that alignment of self-interest, which I think they should, we could get permitting down to 2 or 3 or 4 years. We could create a template for mining that makes sure that the Native American communities, who so often in every one of these mines have been kind of left out in the cold, and make sure that they're from the beginning in the negotiations so they know what's coming. They get a shot at the jobs. If there's a new clean water system going to be built that's large enough to handle their community, those kinds of things that are not even thought about until it's too late. If you get them in early, they're not that expensive. And I think if we had a template of, what is clean mining to make sure there is no pollution for the community around it? What is the remediation? So once the mine has fulfilled its active life, its duty, and you're remediating it to return it to a useful purpose in the community, and that is spelled out, and during the mining, how it's spelled out, what is acceptable, what's not acceptable. Our template in the United States, I think, would probably get diluted, but it would be a similar template that would get used in Malaysia or South America or Eastern Europe, wherever. And I think that would be a great gift to the world to make sure that there's less pollution and less damage to our climate in the process of dealing with climate. So that's one place where, I've done dinners at my house where I had the CEO of Rio Tinto and some of the largest mining companies sitting with the CEOs of a couple of the largest nonprofit environmental communities, just describing, don't we have an alignment of self-interest? Don't we both share a need for better regulation that's fair and making sure that we have a much faster process of getting to the actual mining of our critical minerals so that we can get those minerals where they can do the most good in addressing climate change? And pretty much everyone agreed. We have to figure out how we're going to So many of the environmental communities have members that for years have put in $50 a year or $75 a year, and it's almost always to stop infrastructure investments. It's the highway, or it's the road, or I mean, not the road, the highway, or the power lines, or the pipeline. A lot of that's NIMBY. We just don't want it in our backyard. But a lot of it is just trying to slow down progress. And I think we're at that point now where we've got to recognize that the next flurry, the next rapid set of advancements is going to be in addressing climate if we're any good. And as such, we should, make sure that we make things go a little faster.
I love this. I mean, this is an incredible vision. You're talking about supporting, mining and really using this as a template to get to other places, but a community-forward way of moving faster, creating more jobs, ultimately building the infrastructure we need to build. Sounds incredible. And I'm not currently a U.S. Senator, but I'm on board, so, count me as signed on. But you're a scientist, too. If you had to assign a probability of some vision like this actually coming to pass in terms of legislation that gets signed into law, what would you say is that probability over the next few years?
Well, let's say in the next 3 years, I think it's got 25, 30, 33% chance. I think it's
higher than I thought.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's not as, it's going to take a lot of work. Part of it is we have to recognize that all these nonprofit organizations, they are organisms. They have a life of their own, and like any organism, they don't want to make themselves extinct. And so they've been raising money to pay for their overhead for years by opposing everything and slowing it down. We have to figure out how they can be healthier by looking at this alignment of self-interest and encouraging responsible development. And I'm not sure exactly how that works. I haven't figured that out. I've had, just a half dozen meetings, but I think that's going to be, once we figure that out and can make this a win-win for everybody. We know, if we're permitting for mines, we know that there's got to be transparency, right? In any of these negotiations, hidden negotiations isn't healthy. It just isn't. It never pays. We've learned those lessons, and I think that's the roadway to get to the point where we can finally say, all right, we need environmental organizations to make sure that the public is fairly represented, and that mining companies are held accountable, and processing, it's not just the mining. The processing has to be done with the environment in mind. It can be filthy dirty if people don't do it in the right way. So anyway, all that stuff, those are the major logjams or bottlenecks that I see is that, trying to find how the environmental community can still prosper and be strong and vibrant, because we need them to be strong and vibrant, even as they're changing their stance of what they've had for the last, 50, in some cases, 100 years, looking at just protecting our public lands.
Right. Yeah, it's no joke to make that transition, but a worthy goal. And I have to just thank you one more time. It's so incredible to have this time with you, to be able to understand what you and other folks are doing within the Senate, within Congress, to really help us fight this fight, because we need all hands on deck. So thank you so much for joining us on the show. We really appreciate it.
Well, Lara, thank you so much. And I think what an honor to be on this. This is the first podcast I've done at least in 6 years. So certainly the first podcast as a senator. So I'm honored I got to do it with you.
Well, I'm honored as well. We have some great listeners and a lot of folks who are fighting really hard in the climate fight. So thanks again.
You bet. Thanks for all your work.
John Hickenlooper is the U.S. Senator from Colorado. The Green Blueprint is produced by Latitude Media in partnership with Trellis Climate. The show is hosted by me, Lara Pierpoint. Aaron Hardick and Daniel Woldorf produced this episode. Ann Bailey is our senior editor. Sean Marquand is our technical director. Stephen Lacey is our executive editor. If you'd like to suggest topics or guests for the show, send an email to thegreenblueprint@latitudemedia.com. You can listen to The Green Blueprint at latitudemedia.com or subscribe wherever you get podcasts. And if you have fellow clean energy or climate tech travelers who would benefit from the insights in this show, send them a link. This is The Green Blueprint, a show about the architects of the clean energy economy.